Definitely one of the upsides of economic globalization for me is food from around the world. Back when we used to be able to travel, one of my favorite things to do was trying different forms of food from all over the world. And even though I am here in Canberra, as we've seen so far this semester, you can still get things from water from Norway to water from Fiji. You can get things from all around the world. And in just looking at my pantry today, I wasn't terribly surprised to see the number of different countries that produce the food that I can still depend on, even in the middle of a pandemic. I can get things from home, like corn syrup, which is essential for a good bread pudding, to, let's see what else. We have dal from India, Belgian chocolate, salt from the United Kingdom, Rivita crackers, which was one of the favorite things that I had when I was doing research in Sweden. Was Swedish salmon on crackers. However, these are not actually from Sweden. They're also made in the United Kingdom. We have crackers from Italy, syrup from Canada. I'm not going to throw that. And Moroccan style pumpkin soup, which is actually from Thailand. Oh, and what else do we have? We also have citric acid from China. So my pantry has definitely gotten a lot fuller than when I was a kid. One thing that I think made me appreciate and be interested in food was the fact that I grew up in a family where we really didn't have that much money. I don't remember ever eating out my entire childhood until I was at least 18. And we didn't have that much variety in what we ate. And ever since that I could, one of the things that I have splurged on, besides books, is food. And also, it was the first real career that I had. I stumbled into cooking for a living to help pay for my undergrad, and then helped pay for travel, helped pay for graduate school. And now that I don't earn a living cooking, I guess it helps rekindle my love of cooking and from food. And so this is why I think I'm really going to enjoy today's discussion, and I hope you will too. And we're going to focus on food production and food security. And last couple props that I have are popcorn, corn, one of the largest cereals produced in the world. The other two being wheat. I'm going to cook this dinosaur pasta for my kids tonight once I'm done with this. And rice. Don't have any soybeans, unfortunately. And honestly, why I opened my cabinet to try to find something from somewhere else than Australia, and most of my food is from Australia, is because I was trying to find something from France. Because, let's see if I can change the slide. France is as close to food heaven as I can think of. Different people have different. I love all cuisines, but French food. We had this organic triple cream brie from Costco, which I highly recommend if you ever have the chance. That comes from France. But French farmers are some of the most hardworking, as well as some of the most cantankerous farmers that I've seen in my experience, and they are also some of the most prolific protesters. I don't know how closely you follow French farm protesters. I think the first time I really came across them is when one particular famous farmer dumped a whole truckload of tomatoes outside a McDonald's in France. But this screenshot here is from farmers protesting in Paris a little less than a year ago to try to petition President Macron to answer their concerns. And they have a long history, as with other forms of protest, of farmers protesting for better conditions. Not just tomatoes that they can dump, they also dump pumpkins, as they did in Vaucluse in 2014, or throwing other kinds of material like manure on a government building in Toulouse in the same month. Um, there's nothing that quite gets people emotional, that ties policy into individual behavior. We all have to eat, right? And all countries have some form of domestic production of agricultural goods. Australia is, of course, famous for it. It's one of the top 10 producers of wheat in the world. The French are, it's a developed country with developed regulations, a sizable export market that one of the hardest things about President Trump's efforts at trying to negotiate better deals for the United States was the increasing tax policies and hardline negotiating tactics the U.S. used towards the European Union. Then it ended up leading to additional taxes on French cheeses, Scotch whiskey, wine, any kind of agricultural production output that you can think of from Europe. But one last picture from France. These are some protesters throwing some delicious looking apples at police to show their dissatisfaction with current policies. So no matter where you are, food is something that brings us together, and it's also something that can really get people to hit the streets to try to get different policy from their government. The United States to Japan, to the European Union, a bunch of other countries have specific policies to try to protect their domestic agricultural system. The United States actually went to bat for their agricultural sector a number of years ago. They were sued by Brazilian farmers for unfair practices, lost the case in the World Trade Organization, and the U.S. ended up settling the suit by paying over $100 million a year to Brazilian farmers, so they didn't actually have to pay or change their policies domestically, because they didn't want to have to deal with the domestic politics of shortchanging their farmers. Right now in the United States, there's a bill to try to get more money for American farmers given the pandemic. So from France, a bunch of other countries, you can see that food production as well as food prices, to us actually just trying to get food for ourselves and for our families, can be quite a motivating factor. And I know some students in this class are focusing on food production, climate change, and conflict. There's an established literature, for those of you who aren't studying this topic, linking food prices to protest, riots, and conflict. This is a recent article from May of this year in Foreign Policy by two political scientists talking about how food prices and the politics of food during the pandemic could lead to increasing uncertainty, as well as the United States central bank also, by creating loose monetary policy to deal with the economic downturn, can actually make food prices more expensive around the world. And from that article, we're going to talk more about it later. You can see how food and human security and instability have been fundamentally linked over time. This is not a new phenomenon. One of the contributing factors to the French Revolution was rising food prices. These somber-looking people in the streets in Russia in March 1917 were trying to get action to try to make food cheaper, ended up escalating to what turned into the February Revolution that overthrew the czars and brought in the USSR. And you can think of a lot of other cases, more recent ones as well, in which food can lead to conflict in the hopes of better outcomes. Unfortunately, you can also look to Russia and what became of the USSR to see how subsequent leaders who are brought in to make the situation better can create policies that can also make things worse for certain people around the world. So you might be familiar with the February and October revolutions in Russia, but I'm willing to bet that a good number of you haven't heard about the Holodomor, the famine that hit Ukraine, as well as the larger famine that hit the Soviet Union in the 1930s. This is a memorial in Kiev, in Ukraine, to the Holodomor. It is something that 16 countries have recognized as a genocide, but it doesn't get nearly as much coverage and research as like the Rwandan genocide that we read for this class several articles about, the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust during World War II. There are these other famines that were caused by political policy, right? A couple of weeks ago, I included that quote by Amartya Sen, saying that famines don't happen in democracies, right? That governments have incentive to take care of their citizens. In the Soviet Union, this famine was man-made, not nearly as damaging in the number of deaths as Chinese policy from 1958 to 1960, but it still led to the deaths of around 5 million people, the vast majority of them in Ukraine. The word Holodomor, I misspelled it there, is from the Ukrainian words for hunger and extermination. It was a man-made famine from 1932 to 1933. It was part of it was a result of Stalin's efforts that started in 1929 to collectivize agriculture, right? The 20th century was a period in which people were trying to reinvent what the purpose of government was, what the responsibilities of the individual and the state were. As part of this collectivist approach, there was efforts to try to redistribute land as well as create more policies to who was going to grow what. Last week in the discussion on water, we saw the effects of Stalin's policies in the Central Asian region, saying that Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan were going to grow cotton. This Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of Europe, and other grain-growing regions were collectivized and were the hardest hit by the famines that happened in the 1930s. This led to people being dissatisfied by the central government policy during the battle for after the 1917 revolutions. There was battles and efforts to try to solidify control. These grain-growing areas in Ukraine were some of the areas that rose up against the new government. Stalin didn't forget about that, and so there were areas in which he took the hardest line to try to crack down on uprisings. Some of the other people that were the hardest hits were the wealthier peasants, ones that had something to lose by these kind of collectivization policies. And so the Soviet Union reduced allocations of food and forbade people from traveling to try to get food. And 3.9 million Ukrainians ended up dying in a little over a year. This was something that wasn't talked about. It wasn't recognized within the USSR until a poet mentioned it after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. And truly, until the end of the Cold War, it wasn't something that was recognized and something that was memorialized in the areas in which it actually happened. I mentioned before, 16 states have recognized Holodomor as a genocide, and it was recognized by Australia in 2003. So this little side note to show how you can have millions of people affected by government policies, and people's dissatisfaction leading them to raise up arms against the government, and government's repression being ultimately successful in cracking down on this kind of opposition. Food shocks are not anything new. Food prices have varied quite dramatically over time. I don't know how closely you follow food prices. I kind of focus on the discounts that Kohl's and Woolworths have periodically on things that I actually buy. It's worth giving up my privacy to be able to get the discounts because they can track your shopping with rewards cards. But you can see food prices here from this. These are summary statistics from the foreign policy article that I mentioned before, that you see food prices increase quite dramatically around 2008, 2007, 2008. There was food price spikes as well as 2011. And the article in Foreign Policy is making the link to the ease of monetary policy linking to increased food prices. But you can see cereal prices also increasing and meat as well. The long-term trend is, of course, up, but it has fluctuated, and governments subsidize some crucial food products in certain countries, and when those subsidies are changed or removed, they can also lead people to hit the streets. Also, the difficulty in actually being a producer or seller has caused issues. There's been research in recent years on the Middle East and the Arab Spring, how Mohammed Bouazizi, who was a produce vendor in Tunisia, found it so difficult to conduct business given corruption and government bureaucracy in his area that he ended up lighting himself on fire and killing himself. But there's been other widespread food protests from France to Tunisia to pretty much any country that you can think of. If our ability to feed ourselves and our family is jeopardized, it really does shape those opportunity costs and motivations to use violence that we've already talked about so far this semester. And you can even see more closely this relationship in these two graphs with the food riots on the top and the food price index, which we're going to talk a bit more later on. You see those two spikes in 2008 and 2011 and the corresponding spikes in food riots. So today we're talking about food, right? We're not just talking about props. We're actually talking about the staples as well as the livelihoods of billions of people around the world. And we're going to focus on both potential disputes and actual disputes that focus on food, land access that's necessary to generate food, both agricultural products like grain as well as pastoral products, right? Australia is one of the largest producers of lamb and beef and livestock. Often we're going to see in the case study today how those two fundamental different kinds of food production can come into conflict in the Omo River area around Ethiopia and Kenya, and how climate change can make the situation worse. And the main motivating question that I have for this class is how food production and consumption are linked to human security and conflict. It's one of those things, tying it back to David Foster Wallace, that the most fundamental truths are often the ones that are right in front of us, but that we don't actually see. And so today I wanted to build on last week's discussion of water to shift this week to look at what water can help generate food and life that way. So today, linking it to one of those introductory videos, the puzzle is in developed countries, it's often about what we can do to help the kinds of countries like Ethiopia and the famine and hunger that motivated Live Aid back in 1985. There was this assumption that developed countries can send a bunch of money or send a bunch of goods to developing states to help deal with the famine. Although, as we're going to see, the puzzle is it's not necessarily the amount of food that's around, it's how distributed and how government policies like that used by Stalin can actually be the determining factor as to whether people have enough to eat and what incentives they have to use violence to try to make sure that they do. So it all ties back to David Geldof and all those amazing 80s musicians. A lot of those concert excerpts are available on YouTube as well. So let's get started with talking about food security trends. And I'm going to eat this Belgian chocolate in between. I won't, but I want to.